The Shadow Worker. Jacob had been working the night shift at the 24-hour convenience store for over a year. The monotony didn't bother him. It was quiet, peaceful, and the time flew by as he managed the store alone. But lately, something was off. The air felt heavier, and an odd sense of being watched crept over him every night. It all started after the store's new security system was installed. It began with small glitches. The cameras would cut out at exactly 2 a.m., the feed going dark for a few seconds before returning. But each time the feed came back, Jacob noticed something strange. An extra figure in the footage. A shadowy person, barely visible in the far corner, moving between the aisles. The figure was wearing a store uniform and seemed to be stocking shelves. But Jacob knew for a fact he was the only one there. Each night, the figure became clearer. Jacob grew increasingly uneasy, but when he reviewed the footage, it showed nothing but empty aisles. It was as if the figure only existed when he wasn't looking. Then, one night, he saw it clearly. The shadow wasn't just any figure. It was him, his doppelganger. He froze, staring at the camera, seeing his own face reflected back in the screen, moving like a distorted mirror. But this version of him looked different, paler, thinner, and with a twisted smile on its face. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jacob grabbed a flashlight and hurried into the store's aisles. There was no sign of the figure. The shelves were untouched, everything in its place. The oppressive silence of the store enveloped him, broken only by the low hum of the refrigerators in the back. His breath came out in shallow puffs, the air colder than usual. Then, from behind him, he heard a faint whisper, his own voice saying his name. Jacob whipped around, heart hammering, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time. He tried to call for help, but his phone had mysteriously died, though it had been fully charged just minutes ago. His hand shook as he reached for the store's landline, only to find it too was dead. The lights flickered, and in the brief flashes of darkness he saw it. His doppelganger standing at the other end of the aisle, its eyes black and its smile stretching far too wide. It whispered his name again, but this time Jacob felt the words in his own mind, as though the figure was speaking directly to his thoughts. Panicked, Jacob raced for the exit, but when he reached the door, it wouldn't open. The glass was fogged as though it had been closed for decades, and no matter how hard he pulled, the door remained locked. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:05 a.m. He had been there for hours, but time hadn't moved. His shift was supposed to be over, yet the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The air grew colder, and his breath fogged up in front of him. Then, slowly, Jacob began to feel something strange, a sense of detachment, like he wasn't entirely there. His reflection in the store's glass door flickered, and to his horror, he realized it wasn't him anymore. It was the doppelganger, standing just behind him, its cold breath brushing the back of his neck. "I'll take it from here," it whispered in his voice. Jacob's vision blurred, his body feeling lighter, almost insubstantial. The last thing he saw before the darkness overtook him was his own face, smiling back at him from the reflection. The next morning, the store manager arrived to find the doors locked from the inside. There was no sign of Jacob, but on the security footage, a familiar figure was stalking the shelves, smiling as the clock struck 2 a.m. The empty hospital ward. Mia had heard the rumors about St. Jerome's Hospital long before she started working there. The staff spoke in hushed tones about the third floor, the ward that had been closed off for decades after a mysterious outbreak claimed the lives of dozens of patients. But the hospital had always kept it maintained, clean and, disturbingly, lit. Mia didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and she needed the job, so she brushed off the rumors. On her first few nights of the night shift, Mia couldn't shake the odd feeling that the hospital wasn't as empty as it seemed. The distant sounds of hospital equipment, the beep of a heart monitor, the rattle of a wheelchair. would echo down the halls even though no patients were nearby. When she asked her colleagues, they only offered cryptic smiles, telling her she'd get used to it. But on the fifth night, something changed. As Mia made her rounds, she heard a soft, rasping voice coming from the closed-off third floor. The elevator button for the third floor flickered, despite the fact that no one was supposed to be up there. Curiosity got the better of her, and Mia pressed the button. The elevator doors slid open with a shudder, and she stepped onto the third floor. The air was noticeably colder, and a strange smell lingered. Antiseptic mixed with something rotten. The faint buzz of old fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. As Mia walked down the corridor, she noticed several of the patient room doors were slightly ajar, as though someone had recently passed through. One room in particular caught her eye. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a hospital bed with an elderly man lying in it. His eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow and rasping. "Help! Me!" he whispered, his voice thin and frail. Mia took a step closer, instinctively reaching for the call button, until she remembered this floor had been closed for decades. There were no working call buttons, no staff, and no patients. Panic surged through her. She backed away, but the man's hollow eyes followed her. The lights flickered violently, and in the brief moments of darkness, she saw something horrifying. The man's face was changing, his skin peeling away, revealing a gaunt, skeletal visage beneath. Mia ran for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening thud. She yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her phone was dead, and the hospital's radio crackled with static. She pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the whispers drowned out her voice. "You'll never leave," the man's voice rasped, but it sounded closer, as though it was coming from inside her own mind. The lights flickered again, and this time, when Mia turned back, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, as though no one had been there, but the feeling of being watched remained. She could feel eyes on her, though she couldn't see anyone. Heart pounding, Mia rushed for the elevator, but it wouldn't open. She glanced at her watch. Hours had passed, but the time remained stuck at 3:15 a.m., as if the night itself was frozen. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, closing in. The reflection in the elevator doors showed her something impossible. Her own face, but older, gaunt, with hollow eyes staring back at her. A cold realization crept over her. She wasn't going to leave the third floor. No one ever did. The warehouse haunting. Mark had been the night security guard at the warehouse for over a decade. The vast, silent aisles of shelves stretching high into the ceiling had become familiar to him, comforting in their monotony. But in recent months, something had changed. Boxes would be slightly displaced overnight, the lights would flicker at the far end of the warehouse, and sometimes, late at night, he would hear faint whispers echoing through the empty aisles. At first, Mark dismissed it as his mind playing tricks, but the whispers grew louder, and they started calling his name. One night, while making his rounds, Mark found one of the storage shelves toppled over, scattering boxes across the floor. Annoyed, he went to investigate, but as he bent down to pick up the boxes, he saw something in the shadows at the far end of the aisle. A figure standing still. It was a man, dressed in an old uniform from a bygone era. Mark called out, thinking it was an intruder, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the darkness. Mark followed, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows. But when he reached the end of the aisle, the man was gone. The warehouse was deathly silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then came the sound, soft but deliberate, something heavy being dragged across the floor. Mark's pulse quickened. He turned the corner and froze. Standing just a few feet away was the figure again, but this time he was dragging a length of old, rusted chain behind him. The man's face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into Mark's soul. Mark stepped back, his hand shaking as he reached for his radio. But it was dead, nothing but static coming through. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding him, coming from every direction. Panicked, Mark sprinted toward the exit, but when he reached the door, it wouldn't open. He yanked at the handle, but it was as though the door had fused with the wall. The aisles seemed to stretch out endlessly before him, warping and twisting in ways that defied logic. Behind him, the slow, steady footsteps of the figure drew closer, the clinking of the chain dragging along the floor, echoing in the vast space. Mark tried to scream, but his voice was gone. The whispers drowned out everything, a cacophony of voices overlapping, distorting into something unbearable. And then he saw it, an old security tape, playing on a loop in the corner of his vision. The figure had been there for years, haunting the warehouse, waiting for someone to take his place. The last thing Mark saw before the darkness consumed him was the man's hollow, dead eyes staring back at him, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He never left the warehouse.